Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. I'm going to wait for people to join us. And I see the numbers rising. So happy Wednesday. I think it's Wednesday. Happy, hopefully sunny day after all that rain we've had. So welcome. And as people are joining, just I want to welcome you and thank you for joining Women's Way for Closing the Gender Wealth Gap Forum on Gender-Focused Investing. What happens when we center women? And just for your information, when we refer to women, we mean trans and cis women and femme-identified people, which includes anyone who is not a trans or cis woman, but who identifies as feminine, and also those who identify as gender expansive, non-binary, and are gender non-conforming. So welcome, I'm Diane Corman-Levy, the Chief Disruptor at Women's Way, and I'm delighted that you all decided to spend the next 90 minutes with us on this very important topic. While we wait for folks to sign on, I would appreciate you taking the poll located in the chat box. We want to know if this is your first time attending a Women's Way event. So please, if you will just answer that question, that would be great. So today's forum is part of a year-long series whose purpose is to educate different stakeholders about the drivers of the gender wealth gap and action steps each of us can take to help close the gender wealth gap. Since October 2020, we have conducted 15 forums that address different drivers of the gender wealth gap, such as strengthening the early childhood education sector, gender and racial disparities in healthcare, increasing access to affordable housing, promoting equity in grant making, and creating a more equitable tax code. Today's session focuses on gender-focused investing and what happens when women are at the center of investing as agents and actors and not just beneficiaries. You will hear from three amazing panelists who will address this issue from provider, business incubator, investor, and fund management perspectives. You will also have opportunities to ask questions to the speakers via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer as many of your questions as possible. Closed captioning is enabled. If you do not want to see closed captioning, you can click Hide CC at the bottom of your screen. The chat is also enabled, so please share your comments during this session. We'd love to see how people are responding to the conversation that will be happening among the panelists. And to create a safer space for us to engage in honest and challenging discussions, we ask that each of you, abide to the session norms listed in the chat box. We are recording the session and we will make it available for all of you to view again and for those who could not attend today's session. After the session, we will also send you a list of resources related to today's topic if you want to learn more about it, and a survey to evaluate the session. We really value your input because we use your input to continually improve these educational forums. So I'm now going to just, before we get into the panelists, and that's the meat of this, Kelly Sheard and I, Kelly Sheard, who's the director of the Gender Wealth Institute, and I are going to spend the next few minutes presenting some slides to provide an overview of the economic state of women and children, why Women's Way is investing its resources into addressing the gender wealth gap, and a high-level view of our theory of change for closing the gender wealth gap. I first want to thank our session sponsors. First, our signature sponsor, JPMorgan Chase and Company, who have really been a great strategic partner around our work with closing the gender wealth gap. And Wells Fargo was our cold sponsor, and then the other ones listed here. Thank you all for your support. Real briefly, Women's Way has been around for about 45 years, and we're the region leading nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of women and girls and gender racial equity. And we were actually the first umbrella funding federation in the United States specifically dedicated to women's issues. So we've been working on these issues, unfortunately, for 45 years. Real quickly, the economic state of women, we heard a lot during the COVID, but even pre-COVID, it wasn't great. 80% of workers in the United States were living and still living paycheck to paycheck. Majority are women. 40% of adults are not even able to cover an unexpected $400 expense. Again, majority are women. Philadelphia's poverty rate, I just learned, it's actually decreased a little bit, but we're still the poorest big city among the 10 largest cities, and the region's largest demographic group living in poverty are women ages 25 to 34. So we talk a lot about the pay equity gap, but the gender wealth gap is even larger, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And this is all related to also the retirement gap, where 80% of women are likely to be living in poverty by age 65. So when we talk about the wealth gap, the pay gap is not great, but like I said, the wealth gap is even worse. Single white women own 56 cents on the dollar compared to single white men. Hispanic women own 10 cents and non-Hispanic Black women own 5 cents. And we'll talk a little bit about why is there such a large gender wealth gap, particularly for women of color. If you look at the US economic pyramid, this is very disturbing. 1% of the population holds 47% of the nation's wealth, and 19% holds 44%. So the top 20% hold 91% of the wealth in this country. And of course, the top 1% are predominantly made of heterosexual white Christian men, and there's reasons for that. This is an economic system that was intentionally created this way. And then the bottom 80% only hold 9% of the nation's wealth, and a lot of them are women, people of color, and women of color. And they also included a lot of what we call the essential workers during COVID. This is not a system that's sustainable, and it's also not a system that really helps anyone in our country. And we want to talk a little bit about how did we get here, right? So what are the causes of the gender wealth gap? We talked about women earn less than men. There's still a gender pay gap, and it's not just because of occupational segregation, which really is where fields dominated by women are paid less because they tend to be valued less, but even in the same positions, women are still getting paid less. There are more likely to be mortgages and loans and to be overcharged for them, even though women have a greater record of paying them back than men. They're more vulnerable to predatory lending. They hold more debt, including 2/3 of all student debt. And again, in relation to that, the fastest growing college graduates are women of color, yet the flip side of that, a lot of them are holding student debt. Again, women provide the majority of unpaid caregiving, which is a huge issue for women in terms of reaching financial stability. And the last one that's in bold we'll be focusing on today. There's lack of women represented across all capital markets. And that has a huge impact on building an equitable business ecosystem. And we'll talk a little bit about gender roles and biases driving that. So what's really interesting is, if you look at data, women control or influence 85% of consumer spending worldwide. And worldwide, they control over almost $32 trillion in spending. And that's research-based, but yet 91% of women feel that advertisers don't understand them and don't hear them. Women make up 80% of household health decisions, but 66% feel misunderstood by healthcare marketers. There's a disconnect here. And Black and brown women are the fastest growing entrepreneurs, but receive 0.0006% of all venture capital financing. And what's partly driving that is, in 2020, only 3% of decision makers at venture capital firms in the United States were Black, and only 9% were women. So again, if there's a lack of representation of women and women of color in these positions, you can see how that affects the distribution of resources. So we need to answer the questions. What happens when women do not share in the control of capital and are not included in decision making? And on the flip side, what happens when women are at the center of investing as agents and actors and not just beneficiaries? And we're gonna go dive deep into these questions today. And real quickly, when we Women's Way talk about wealth, we don't just talk about assets minus liabilities. It's a much broader concept. So it's about living and retiring with dignity, freedom, and peace of mind. It's about living in communities that are safe, resilient, and vibrant. It's about being able to invest in future generations and also having the freedom to dream big. Because when you're living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, you don't have the freedom to even envision the future. And it's about making sure that we're healthy and that our family network and communities are healthy and contributing. So we at Women's Way believe we need a new bold vision, right, for our economy, one that provides solutions to centuries of systemic exclusion, extraction, and exploitation that continues to undermine our economy locally, regionally, and nationally. So we started something called the Gender Wealth Institute a couple of years ago. Our vision is to close the gender wealth gap by advancing research and practical solutions that build wealth for women. And this is built on a strong foundation of working with over 100 partners who really care about this issue and have been working with us to try to come up with real strategies to address the root causes of the gender wealth gap. I'm now going to pass it over to wonderful partner in crime, Kelly Sheard.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm here to provide framing and context for the connection between white supremacy and the gender wealth gap. Why are we talking about white supremacy? It's because white supremacy is a tool used to create, maintain, and perpetuate all gender and racial inequities. It's the operating framework for how inequities work. So next slide. This slide provides an explanation of what white supremacy is and what it's there to do. So think of it like a tool. Next slide. White supremacy functions in a variety of systems. The common thread is the privileging of a constructed definition of whiteness and the dehumanization of all others. Whiteness becomes an asset. Take a minute to review how white supremacy shows up in various systems. Next slide. So I'll also give a minute to read this slide and quote, "It's important to know that white supremacy is not just a tool used by white people. Consider the three things white supremacy is here to do: justify dehumanization, hoard power, and disconnect and divide." Next slide. As it relates to gender injustices, such as the gender wealth gap, we draw your attention to a concept known as racialized patriarchy. If white supremacy is the motherboard, racialized patriarchy is the specific code that enables the stratified exploitation of genders other than male. Think of it this way. White supremacy is how we get to a place where people other than white have deliberate unequal access, marginalized experiences, and diminished expressions of power. Racialized patriarchy is how we understand the continual interplay of race and gender in the expression of power. Next slide. In racialized patriarchy, there's a process of racialization where people are separated and categorized by hierarchy for the purpose of privileging whiteness. At the same time, there's the promotion of the idea of a gender binary. Patriarchy is a use of a male-female binary to monopolize social, political, and economic power to privilege men. It's a system where cultural ideas about value are attributed to and played out through sex roles. It falsely claims that biology drives a common gendered experience. Racialized patriarchy takes the myths of racialization and gender binary to reinforce the goals of white supremacy. Next slide. The economic legacy of white supremacy and racialized patriarchy show up as pay disparities, lost time and generational wealth transfers, higher levels of debt, and little to no protection from abject poverty. This slide shows some of the ways we continue to uphold the economic interest of the powerful through racialized patriarchy. Next slide. Now let's shift to the topic of gender-focused investing. Investing is simply allocating resources with the expectation that there will be a profit made or an income earned. You can think of it as purchasing an item of value at a low price and then selling it at a higher price. Assuming that thing increases in value from the time you bought it to the time you sell it, the money you make off of that sale is your return on investment or your capital gain. There are several roles in the system of investing. There are consumers, such as companies, governments, individuals, and business owners. There are financial system providers, fund managers, research analysts, and traders. And then there are rule makers. Investment management is simply handling financial assets by developing a strategy for what and when to buy and sell for a specific objective. It could be estate planning, retirement, distributing assets in a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. The entire investment management system is made up of people and infrastructure. That is, processes, rules, capabilities, behaviors, and information that all work together to shape the way investments are managed. Next slide. When managers of funds or assets make decisions, they consider several factors. Is this risky? How long is it risky? What are we trying to accomplish? What can we expect to happen based on our research and analysis? There are also several kinds of investment decisions to be made, such as buying a piece of important equipment, updating a system into something modern, growing a business, or giving money for a new business to start. Next slide. Now we want to look into how gender norms influence women's participation in the economy by way of investment decisions. Next slide. First, let's define gender roles. Gender roles are a subset of social norms or collectively held expectations for how people should behave based on their gender identity. So taking this further, gender role theory is a concept based on roles and expectations based on gender. The idea is that there's a gender binary and there are acceptable behaviors for men and women. Masculine behaviors are those sorted and assigned to males, and feminine behaviors are sorted and assigned to females. Typically, feminine behaviors are those we think of as communal and interpersonally oriented traits, being nurturing, warm, and expressive. Masculine behaviors are task-oriented, aggressive, dominant, independent. Professions associated with behaviors of power, leadership, and authority are stereotyped as masculine, and professions associated with behaviors of nurturance and caregiving are stereotyped as feminine. Acceptability, then, is males with masculine traits in masculine professions and vice versa. Gender role congruity theory takes this further. So it's not just your biological sex. It's not just what I believe is acceptable behavior for your biological sex. It's my judgment about the behavior as good or bad. So it's the value judgment I attach to the behavior that's then sorted and organized in a biased fashion. So going back to gender stereotype behaviors, feminized behaviors typically receive more negative feedback no matter what gender acts them out. In the case of entrepreneurs, for example, femininity is seen at odds with entrepreneurial success. To be feminine is to lack competency with business growth. So gender role theory might say, okay, if entrepreneurship is normed as a masculine profession, if a woman wants to be successful as an entrepreneur, then they should adopt masculine qualities. Gender role congruity theory says two things. One, if you act outside of your gender stereotype, it's a mismatch and you'll be punished for violating a gender norm. Two, if you act inside of your gender stereotype as a woman, you will also be penalized because we don't value the behavior precisely because it's associated with women. So if a woman entrepreneur acts in ways that disrupt a gender norm by adopting masculine stereotyped behaviors, they're likely to lose approval and be negatively perceived by others. But then, if feminine stereotyped behaviors are negatively associated with business competence and preparedness and leadership, it's an impossible bind. Next slide. Our ideas about roles and responsibilities play out in our gendered expectations of women. In the UN Women's Gender Equality Attitude Survey, we learned how this shows up in men and women. 40% of all male respondents agree, for example, that men are better business executives, and 27% of women agree. 49% of all respondents believe that women should be the primary caregiver at home. 42% of all respondents feel that lower paid service jobs are more suitable for women. So let's go back to our example of all the roles in an investment management system and combine this with our understanding of gendered roles and expectation. The behavior of an individual in this system can be shaped by factors that are structural, internal, or collective. Knowing what we know about gendered stereotypes and how they're enacted through bias and discrimination, which our panel will no doubt touch on, what outcomes might we expect in this system? Next slide. Oh, am I frozen? I'm not frozen. Okay. All right. I see Diane is moving and grooving. She's going to get us to our next slide, but I'm going to keep talking as she's moving and grooving. Oh, look at that. It was the patriarchy trying to stop us before we rebelled. All right. So what do? Here are a couple of schools of thought that suggested ways that we might rethink and reorient our strategies around gender-focused investing. As we think about gender norms and how they impact decisions and actions in an investment system, here are some dimensions to consider. Next slide. Bias can show up structurally, internally, and collectively. Now let us look this over for a second. Next slide. How do we know a gender norm is present and influencing our decisions and influencing a system? We can look at the prevalence of gender norms, the expectations around the norm, and the consequences of breaking the norm. As we construct an economy that exists to meaningfully include everyone, here are a few suggested strategies. Next slide. So if you take a look at these, some are more focused on equality within a binary, some are more focused on equity. One question to consider is, are any truly focused on a system that shifts policy, practice, and culture? What about agents and actors in the system who are not easily classified, undifferentiated, or androgynous in the binary? What solutions do we truly need to break out of the box? Next slide. While liberation is a messy process and considerations abound, remember that the process of uncovering and unpacking is critical. Part of the work of liberation is to uncover the plot, that is, the intentions, actions, and outcomes. Next slide. I'm very happy to introduce our moderator, Alexandra Cawthorne Gaines, who is the Executive Director for Financial Health and Wealth Creation for JPMorgan Chase PolicyCenter. Alexandra will be leading our panel and will introduce them and lead us in our discussion. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon, and I very much appreciate the helpful overview you gave. Before we jump to introducing the panel, I just wanted to say just a couple of things. The people and organizations represented on today's webinar are truly committed to advancing gender equity and financial inclusion across all the domains, many of which we talked about in the opening, in which we see disparities. But it's important to note, however, that income and wealth disparities do not only impact women and people of color. At JPMorgan Chase, we recognize that supporting the wealth creation and the economic success of women, especially Black and Brown women, is foundational to building a more equitable and inclusive community or economies for all. And so today we have a panel of experts that are leveraging both best practices and data to advance tangible solutions that will encourage entrepreneurship, create jobs, and hopefully lead to intergenerational wealth creation. With that, I'd love to have each panelist share a bit of information about themselves and why they chose to be on this panel. And so we'll start with Ann Kennedy, who's Managing Director with the Mastersfund.
Thank you so much. It's Alexandra. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Kelly, for your comments. Thank you, Diane. I am Managing Director of the Mastersfund. We are a fund that invests exclusively in women founders, and we have an ambitious goal of funding 100 companies over 3 years and seating 100 diverse boards. And we'll have a lot of talk about that later. I wanted to be here because I really believe fiercely in the goals of this organization, and that in order to I thought that I would have something to offer on our corner of the world of helping to close the gender wealth gap. Now, you mentioned 3% of women are in decision-making positions in venture capital. Actually, only 1.2 or 3% of us are actually fund managers in venture capital, and I'm one of them. So this is, as my co-founder Julian Music likes to say, this is the hill we will die on. That's what we're doing.
Yes, I love it.
Thank you, Anne. And we'll turn to Tanya Morris, founder and CEO of Mom Your Business.
Thank you, Alexandra. Much like Anne, this is the hill that we will die on, of helping Black female entrepreneurs to achieve exponential business growth. Black women are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs, yet the least funded, as Diane stated earlier. We provide a business accelerator program to help to increase those opportunities of access to capital markets and networks, as well as technical assistance to help those businesses to grow and to achieve success in their businesses. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Tanya. And Vivian Okoro, Vice President Analyst with BNY Mellon Investment Management. Go ahead and say a few things about yourself and why you're here today.
Thank you, Alexandra, and good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. So my name is Vivian Okoro, and I am a mother of 2 young girls, ages 3 and 6. And I'm proud to be working for BNY Mellon Investment Management, a company that truly embodies diversity, equity, and inclusion values. At BNY Mellon, I'm primarily responsible for conducting due diligence research on investment managers across our platform, particularly in the equity space. And I also lead our team's research efforts around responsible investing. I feel very honored to be on this panel discussing a topic that is near and dear to me. And I believe that there's so much that we as a society can achieve when we work to enrich the lives of women and girls in our society and communities. And so, you know, whether it's with regards to providing women and girls with, opportunities for advancement in business, education, healthcare, well-being, you name it. My favorite motto is lifting as we climb. So as we gather knowledge around the importance of gender investing, being in a space like this to be able to share, that knowledge is my way of sharing insights into how we can uplift the women in our society and communities. So I'm grateful to Women's Way for giving me this opportunity to, be on the panel today.
That's great. We have a powerhouse here, so I'm excited to get started. I think the audience and particularly folks who might not be as familiar with this concept, we're talking about gender-focused investing today. So I'd love to hear from each of you what we mean by this, and how does your company, your organization foster this type of investment?
Okay, I can.
Vivian.
Okay, I can go. So, when I think about gender-focused investing, I think about the positive impact that this type of investing can potentially have on the lives of women and girls. So gender-focused investing, it's really an approach to investing where there is an intent to address gender issues or promote gender equity. So this type of investing can be done via multiple ways. So one, it's investing that can be done via investments in businesses that are either owned or led by women of color. It's also investing that can also be in businesses that provide a specific service or products that are geared towards improving the lives of women and girls. And then finally, I would say it's investing in enterprises that do promote workplace equity across ranks. In terms of how my organization, BNY Mellon, fosters this type of investing, there are key things I'd like to point out here. First, from a firm-wide perspective, at our core, we at BNY Mellon believe that DEI is vital to success. And it's also part of our core stated values that codify our culture, which include passion for excellence, strength in diversity, courage to lead, and integrity. Women make up 40% of our global workforce. 31% of women, of senior leaders are women, and 30% of board of directors are women, and 40% of our new hires are women. From a community perspective, and as part of our ongoing commitment to gender equality, BNY Mellon does partner with charitable organizations that do promote the development and advancement and leadership amongst women and girls, including Girls Inc., which is a nonprofit organization that you all may know. In addition, though not entirely focused on women, the firm engages in philanthropic efforts to promote and advance economic and racial justice within the underserved communities. We also partner with historically Black colleges and universities to recruit diverse talent, and also provide scholarships to these schools as well. We do have a supplier diversity program, which the firm provides opportunities to women and diverse-owned businesses. And in addition to that, we also outline expectations for our suppliers to employ women and diverse-owned businesses within their own supply chain. From a product perspective, we have a number of diversity, equity, and inclusion focused strategies on the platform. Included in our offerings is a gender-focused ETF strategy, which invests in companies that incorporate gender equitable practice in the workplace, or companies that provide products and services that enhance the ability of women to meet their work and or personal life responsibilities and needs, From an engagement standpoint, the firm is also actively engaged in encouraging and empowering women when it comes to investments. We have published a number of thought leadership pieces around DEI, including a paper which actually focuses on closing the gender investment gap and the benefits that should result. We also published a white paper on diversity and inclusion in investment management, and working on another version of that paper, which will detail our manager researcher approach to assessing investment managers' DEI within a factor framework. And then lastly, the firm has also partnered with the US 30% Club on their Mission Gender Mentoring Equity Program. And this is really in an effort to promote and advance women across the organization. So all in all, I would say that these are some of the ways that the various ways that BNY Mellon does help to foster this type of investing.
Thank you, Vivian. That was actually a very helpful overview of how the company is doing it. And also in your earlier part of the question, digging into what gender-focused investment is, I picked up a couple of themes. First, intentionality really needs to be there. And there's you listed 3 different ways in which this can show up. Investing in businesses owned by women, gender-focused product investment, and then workplace equity strategies. And would you add anything to that definition? And then can you talk a little bit about how this shows up in the work that you do?
It's such a broad thing to describe, a gender lens investing. Jillian and I have been looking at this we're in our 10th year of working together and the 5th year of our fund. But we chose to focus on ownership, that ownership is what will advance wealth. Now, our purpose, our mission is to create a lot of wealthy women who founded companies and then built their successful companies that are prosperous in their communities. They may or may not be unicorns. That's not the point. The point is to build up prosperous, sustainable companies. And I'll get to how we foster that as opposed to some of our colleagues in venture capital. But what we require, we believe in diverse teams. What we require is that there be at minimum one woman, usually a founder, frequently a CEO, but who has strategic and operational control and has sufficient ownership and compensation so that she really is an owner of the company. We require that. We have some of our companies are solo women founders. Some of our companies are 2 women, a pair of women founders, and some of them are a woman and a man founder. Because our origin story, I want to tell you this real quick because it comes from Philadelphia. Even though I don't live there anymore, I live in Oregon. But our fund is named after Sibylla Masters, who was a 17th century, no, 18th century. It was 1715, invented a machine to grind corn. And she went to England to seek a patent. And King George didn't know much about patents in those days, so it took a while to figure it out. It was the first patent awarded to any person in the colonies, and it was awarded to her husband because in 1715, a wife was herself owned. She couldn't own it. But that wonderful man said, he required that it be written a patent awarded to Thomas Masters for an invention found out by his wife, Sibylla Wrighton Masters. And to that end, her name was preserved. Otherwise, it would have been forgotten. So we believe in diverse teams, gender diverse, age diverse, culturally diverse, geographically diverse. We have all those things on our own team and among our teams of portfolios. And we believe that this is all very important. But the point is to get back to what we're talking about here. The point is to increase wealth for women by providing them access to capital to make the companies that succeed and make them wealthy. But we have a second secret agenda. We want to make them multimillionaires so they will come back and invest in us and create more funds, because we figure more like us is going to be better. So that's how we approach that.
Thank you, Anne. And it leads nicely into Tanya. If you want to talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing at Mom Your Business, and if you have anything to add as far as how we define this very broad topic of gender-focused investing.
Well, I think that Anne and Vivian have done an excellent job in defining it. For us, it was pretty simple. Our organization was really birthed out of the frustration of friends and colleagues who were starting businesses, running businesses, but didn't have the capital to grow their business. And so for us, it was really just about helping to find ways for them to do just that. And so whether that was connecting them to the right resource, whether that was identifying financial partners, whether that be a CDFI, community development financial institution, a venture capital, an angel investor, all of those type of resources, we just wanted to really help Black women in particular to be able to control the size of their family by controlling their economy, controlling their own personal wealth. And so that's what we really kind of focus on. And so the education that comes with that, I think the one thing that we have to look at to add to the definition, if we're going to add anything, is the fact that, you know, Black women haven't had the access to capital despite having comparable educational values and having comparable work experience. We've not been able to access similar opportunities to grow, whether that be in corporate America or even as entrepreneurs. And so those are the things that we want to really try to do. And so we, in addition to our programs, provide emergency grants to small business owners to help them to grow their business. We're also part of a fund, an impact fund that we started in partnership with Women's Way and Zenith Wealth Partners to help these founders to begin to access capital in the way that meets them where they are. So whether that's a grant, whether that is a low to no interest loan, or whether that is equity, we wanted to be able to create a pathway that leads them to growth and scale their businesses in a way that is sustainable, that allows them to control their own destiny financially.
That's great. Thank you, Tanya. I think what I want to do is take a step back and talk a little bit about an important actor in this ecosystem. And this question is for Vivian. Can we talk a little bit about investment managers and how they might incorporate gender diversity considerations when they think about solutions along the lines of some of what we discussed here already?
Yes, absolutely. So in general, we see three different types of approaches that investment managers take towards incorporating gender diversity factors into their portfolios. One of those approaches is actually screening. So typically, screening approaches are used to align a portfolio for client values, and they're most suitable for investors who believe that increasing diversity in businesses is the right thing to do. So here, what you typically see is that managers are looking to avoid companies with poor gender diversity statistics. And then they will invest in companies with high or favorable gender statistics. For example, there are gender-focused strategies today, which screens out companies that do not meet their thresholds for women on boards and or women in C-suite. So we see managers having a 30% threshold of women on boards and women in C-suite, and they, if a company doesn't meet that threshold, it automatically gets screened out from the portfolio. Then there are other strategies within this screening approach that, in addition to looking at women on boards and in C-suite, they also look at additional gender-based issues, including and investing in only companies that have really good policies that benefit women broadly, such as pay equity, paid maternity leave, and then excluding companies with really with discrimination or sexual harassment or poor human rights and workplace safety. So that's one approach. The second approach that we typically see in the industry is ESG integration. So this approach really entails the incorporation of gender diversity factors alongside other environmental, social, and governance factors into the financial analysis. And the belief here is that there is value that can be gained because by identifying companies the investment managers view as having strong gender diversity practices, they are not only able to reduce their portfolio risk, but they can also improve overall long-term performance. And generally speaking, the managers that employ this type of approach, they seek companies where diversity is included as part of the overall business strategy. A key component of this approach is what we call engagement, whereby the investment manager is actively engaged with companies. They're helping encourage companies to improve on their gender diversity statistics or their gender diversity policies and programs in place. There is also the proxy voting as part of the engagement, where the investment managers can actually vote on matters that are related to board of director nominees and or matters that are related to their DEI, a company's DEI policies or program. And then lastly, I would say the last approach that we see is impact. And I think Anne touched on this, so did Tanya in some way. But the managers who employ this approach, they seek to intentionally drive improved, positive, better gender diversity outcomes with their invested capital. I think the intentionality is very important here. The approach is really about the manager really identifying issues or an issue that they view as impacting the lives of women and girls, and then putting their capital to work in those companies or businesses that are actually coming up, providing solutions to tackle those problems in a way that benefits women and girls in our society. So think about things like affordable healthcare, affordable childcare, mental health care, education, access to clean energy. There's a long list. And besides the intentionality components that we see with this type of strategy, with this type of approach, the strategy is also seek to generate positive, measurable impact, showing key metrics that are used to assess the progress. So for example, if the focus of the manager is investing in companies that improve, that incorporates gender equitable practices, then a metric we can use to assess the progress in this particular area to ensure that the manager is actually delivering on its objective is looking at things like gender wage equity. This looks at the average wage paid to female employees of an organization for a specific position, and it compares it to the average wage that's paid to male employees for the same position for a specific period in time. So overall, I would say, this really does round up the different types of approaches that we see managers employ when it comes to incorporating gender diversity factors into their portfolios.
That's very helpful. It seems that there are quite a few approaches that you can take, but I thought it'd be helpful maybe to dive a little bit more into maybe the screening conversation, and in particular thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and how you assess that. Can you talk a little bit more about your approach to that DEI assessment?
Okay, so our approach, we spent a significant amount of time within the manager research group really coming up with our proprietary framework in assessing investment managers' efforts around DEI. So I can spend a day talking about it, but in the interest of time, I'm going to try to keep this short, but happy to chat with anyone who's interested after this event. So within our investment manager evaluation framework, we have developed a comprehensive DEI assessment to provide a holistic view of a firm and its strategies, commitment to DEI. There are actually 7 distinct factors that we look at, which we've identified as providing a holistic insight into how a firm and or its investment strategies committed to DEI. And across the industry, there's a huge emphasis on, ownership levels. And within our framework, we consider other factors which we believe to be just as important beyond looking at ownership levels. We also have a detailed questionnaire which we send out to our investment managers to complete on their DEI efforts. The responses that we get from the investment managers combined with our qualitative assessment on their DEI efforts really helps us to not just collect important information as it pertains to DEI, but it helps us to track and monitor the progress that these managers are making in terms of, doing better when it comes to DEI year over year. And so I'll go into the factors, but just give a high level overview. So the first factor we look at, of course, it's ownership and accessibility. So here we seek to measure the diverse composition of the firm's ownership structure. We look at history of ownership. We're looking at the level of accessibility for diverse individuals within the firm to actually obtain ownership in the firm. The second factor we look at is we look at the firm strategy, the objectives, and the leadership as it pertains to DEI. We evaluate the degree to which DEI is embedded in the firm's values and its culture, as well as really seek to understand from the firm's viewpoint how DEI is viewed as an integral component to their success. The third factor we evaluate is aligning actions and values, right? We want firms that walk the walk. So here we want to see that DEI is within the firm's stated values and visions with concerted efforts to improve and reinforce DEI through corporate social responsibility programs, community service, and or the impact DEI strategies that may be included in their product lineup. And then the other factor we look at is workforce measurement and accountability and recruiting. We're assessing workforce representation by diverse groups across all job functions. So not just looking at the senior leadership of the C-suite or the board of directors, but we're assessing representation across job functions. We're looking to see what sort of hiring and retention practices they have in place. We're looking for upward mobility opportunities. We're looking at pay equity, and whether accountability actually does exist across the organization for meeting these DEI objectives. The other factor we look at is communications and transparency. We want to see consistent messaging throughout the organization DEI with, are there frequent communications on internal DEI policies and employee training? Is that mandated? We want to see that employee training on DEI issues are being mandated across employees within the organization. We also look at team diversity on the strategy level. So aside from just the overall firm level diversity, we assess the level of diverse representation within the strategy team. We're considering the roles and responsibilities of all individuals that are responsible for managing the strategy, as well as the expectation of continued or improved team diversity in the future. We want to see that there's a clear articulation, of intent to fairly advance diverse talent amongst investment professionals that are managing the strategy. And finally, we look at how aligned the firm's DEI strategy, if any, is with the firm level efforts around DEI. We are essentially assessing the degree to which the strategy promotes DEI within the industry or externally through the strategy objective. We expect that, firms that have a strategy with a DEI focus, we expect that they would show favorable firm level DEI characteristics, but that isn't always the case. So this factor is really important to us in identifying managers that may be DEI washing. And by that, I mean instances where a manager's marketing materials may be exaggerating the action around diversity and inclusion, and could potentially expose situations where a firm may have a DEI-focused strategy, yet the firm may not appear committed to DEI through its actions, its values, and its workforce. So overall, the factors does help us to uncover where there is an alignment of actions with what the managers are saying they're doing as it relates to DEI and the level of, and its level of importance within the firm.
Thank you, Vivian. I'm gonna shift to another part of the ecosystem when we talk about gender-focused investing and focus a bit on access to capital. Data shows that Black and Brown women are the fastest growing demographic of entrepreneurs in the US, but we know they face disproportionate financial headwinds. The amount of venture capital awarded to businesses owned by women of color is at a historic low. We heard Diane share that Black and Brown women entrepreneurs only receive 0.0006% of all venture capital financing. And what's behind this abysmal amount of financing or funding for women of color founders?
My favorite question. I'd also like to point out that this has been true since the invention of venture capital 74 years ago. And here's the reality. The top quartile venture capital firms are mostly in New York and Silicon Valley, with a few exceptions. In those companies, the people who get funded that are tall, 30-something, able-bodied, white, male, with a baritone voice, who went to Harvard or Stanford. So if you get any one of those, you don't have it as points off, including the baritone voice. So that's the reality as it has been. And so if we look over 74 years of venture capital, which was invented to fund the next big thing. And in fact, in the last century, I love to say that, last century actually did bring us some phenomenal things. The internet, cell phones, I mean, it just goes on and on, right? So Microsoft, Apple, but to think that this very slim segment of the human genome is capable of coming up with solutions for all the problems that need solving. Well, we've seen the example of that. It's not happening, right? You both my co-panelists outlined a number of things that are still going wanting and are not being solved. And the original venture capital was designed to fund the next big thing. What it wasn't designed to do was fund the things, the next very decent thing that is built on the big things, the big platforms. So it's easy to say it's bias, and it is, but it's a little bit more vestigial than that. It's pattern matching. It's that we are comfortable with people who look like us. And so when it comes to this small group of venture capitalists, in this one sliver of the human genome, funding people who look like them, right? And that is where the basis of it is, that it is what we might call bias. It is clearly a bias, but to merely complain about that isn't going to get the job done. That's why we started what we wanted to do, was to bring new people, more money from different hands to go into different hands, so that we could create more wealth for women in the world. So the funding culture has been so narrowly focused. And one of the things I would love to talk about later if there's time is we realized we had to meet women where they were. Another fact about the 2% number is that actually is Series A funding, which is after pre-seed and seed. What happens for the few women, and we know there are a few examples out there who get through that, when they get to the B and C funding, it's equitable, more or less even between male and female. So that reason is that by that stage, it's all about the numbers and the performance. But it's that A stage where it's about the making the potential funding source comfortable with the person seeking funding. And that's why we chose to fund it just before that level to prepare our women to get through the Series A. And if need be, we will take the Series A to get them through it so they can scale their companies, because that is the eye of the needle that they have to get through in venture capital.
Can I just add something to that, Alexandra?
Yes, please do.
Because Ann set me up real nicely there, because when you add to everything that Ann has said, when you add to that the fact that to Ann's point, which is why we need more women that look like me as fund managers, right? Because the studies show, and Ruth Shaber lays this out beautifully in her book, The Double X Edge, the fact that women are more likely to invest in women. And so this is where this leveling of the playing field, and why we're having this conversation today, right, is because we are more likely not only to invest in women, we make better financial decisions also, right? And so when you factor in those things, like Ann said, investing in the next big thing, you miss out on so many other things because you don't fit the mold. And we'll just use just one example of the young man who started WeWork. He came back after that major epic fail in many senses of losing that company, and was able to raise another $1 million for a business to this, millions of dollars for a business to this date that no one even has heard from, right? But because he looks and walks and talks the part, those things are overlooked. So it's important for there to be more fund managers that look like me, that invest in women. And then to Ann's point about the Series A round, it is harder for women. Women rarely make it to the Series A round, and women of color specifically don't make it there, because at the early stages of the family and friends round, we don't have, because we have been so wealth denied and biased, we don't have the rich uncle, we don't have the rich grandfather to go and ask for thousands and thousands of dollars to invest in our businesses at those stages, to even get us to a pre-seed or seed stage round in order to get to the Series A. So one thing I tell our founders is that everybody's not going to be Rihanna. Everybody's not going to be the next unicorn. It's just not a reality. And add to that, I want to add one more statistic. Women are less likely, there are fewer women that have $1 million companies as well. So when you add in all these factors, right, this is why the gender lens is so important. But it's going to take, for women like Ann and myself and Diane and some of the, Arlen Hamiltons of the world and Monique Greenwoods of the world, it's going to take the Candace Brakeens of the world that are investing in women in order for us to begin to change those numbers.
I would also like to add one point, because we're talking about what's right, and we all believe that passionately. We have 25 years worth of data now that women-run businesses perform better. And to the point of your women fund managers that you were talking about, they or companies, funds that have women in leadership, they will perform better. And so we look at it, in addition to being the right thing to do, we look at it as a risk mitigating factor because we believe our companies are more likely to succeed when there is women in leadership. And we also have a personal portfolio from our angel investing days that are not all women led. And I got to tell you, the all male teams, they're floundering. And the ones with women on them are moving it forward. And so we just consider that proof positive that not only is it the right thing to do, but it's good business. And the second thing about having diversity, because in some ways, the whole comments about white supremacy, I kept thinking, yeah, you're talking about white male supremacy. But in fact, there is a white female supremacy thing going on, I'm sure. But the when we talk about the leadership and the women that are of color getting the money, then we know that if they are in leadership, that the diverse teams bring access to larger markets, open markets faster, because it's like any other carbon life form. If you have a diversity of influences in it, you have a stronger carbon life form. And so we believe it is good business to have diversity in what we do. And we believe it is good business to be investing in women-led companies. And we won't rest until there's equity in that situation.
Tanya, and you both just started to get at this question, which I'd love to dive a little bit more into tactically and really talk about what are some of these strategies to really get more women founders funded, especially women of color, and that we see that there are truly material and social risks to investment when women aren't involved. And we've seen, businesses thrive that are women led. What are some of the tactics that we can employ to really get at this problem?
Well, I think short of reparations, I think, again, it starts with women investing in other women. It takes women like Anne, honestly, white women, and those that have control of the wealth to really begin to have equity in investing in those businesses. As I said earlier, we have a fund, First Market Ventures, of which Women's Way and Zenith Wealth Partners are part of, and our first investor is Ruth Shaver. So she's walking the talk that she talks in her book Double X Edge about diverse-led teams and the success, as Ann talked about, that those teams will have when given the opportunity. So that's one thing. The other thing is, because we get a lot of pushback on women of color businesses not being prepared. And that's where organizations like Mom Your Business comes into play, to prepare them and to ensure that they are bankable. And, we have to do that despite the disparities in credit, despite the disparities in access to capital. It is one of the things that we are focused on, is helping to ensure that those businesses are in fact bankable when those opportunities present themselves. So those are two ways that we want to try to make that happen.
And to take it to the next step, and I want to know some of your businesses. I'm sure that we'll want them for deal flow, but what we do is, I mentioned before, we felt we needed to, we looked at the way venture capital works, and Jillian and I have been in some form of fiduciary leadership in nonprofit and for-profit for decades. We had to take a close look at venture capital, see why isn't this working? Why do more than 96% of all venture funded companies never return, never have an exit? We realized it's not that they made a mistake. These were the finest companies of the planet. They made it through the gauntlet. They got their Series A. Mostly they're run by guys. But anyway, we figured that it was the funding model. And the way conventional venture capital works is, you just round numbers, you invest in 20 companies, you burn 80% of them, a few may continue to operate, but one will have the exit, and that one has to provide outside returns to pay for all the expenses. Running a fund is an expensive operation, to pay for all the expenses of the rest of the funds that never had an exit. So we said, there's a problem there. And we realized that the questions that women were being asked, women founders, the question they were being asked is, does your company look like it has the potential to grow, to scale up and give us a minimum 10x return, and we really prefer 100x, thank you very much, and become a unicorn? Well, here's the thing about unicorns. Other than the fact that they are a fantasy, since 1974 and the invention of venture capital, we just last year hit our 1,000th unicorn. They are rare, and yet they get all the press. And so everybody, I can't tell you, the founders walk in and they say, I want to build the next unicorn. And I say, why? Why not just build a nice, profitable mid-cap company with a, a valuation of, say, 500 million and just operate forever, make yourself a cash cow. Anyway, so we figured it needed a new funding model. So we created one. And this is to meet the women where they were in their stage of not being able to get into the venture capital, some of them not having the ability, as you so rightly pointed out, to Tanya, to have the early angel rounds, all of that. And so we created it's called revenue-based funding model, where we calculate with the company based on their projections that they will be able to begin to pay us back in 3 to 5 years, which is a very different question from conventional venture capital, which asks, is it going to be a unicorn, or are we going to see a big exit? We ask the question, does the company have the capacity to become profitable enough to pay us back? And then after 3 to 5 years, we're out of it. But meanwhile, we have created with them a strong corporate structure with a board of directors and everything else they need to move forward to get to their Series A. And by then their company should be worth several times more than they paid us back for our initial investment. And we've figured this put the emphasis on building profitable companies to make communities prosperous, rather than making a few companies in these 2 cities on each side of the coast fabulously wealthy. And so that was our focus. But we figured it was the model. And there are other models for revenue-based funding. There are something called venture debt, which is a different thing entirely, but similar. And there are other funding models that employ different kinds of revenue-based dividend models, that sort of thing. The best part about these models is that the owners, the founders, get to keep the ownership of their company, because the minute they take a penny of conventional venture capital, they've agreed to 2 things. One, they will sell their company as quickly and expeditiously as possible. And 2, they serve at the pleasure of the board, and they can, and 8 out of 10 times will be replaced before the exit. So men and women. So we figured the model will have wide-reaching implications across economies as we build up these companies for a prosperous mid-cap range. So that was our approach, was to start with what Tanya was saying as we sourced our deals, and then moving into how do we provide a funding model that supports them instead of drives them into a place that they don't really need to go and maybe isn't in anybody's best interest.
Can I add one more thing? To Ann's point is that meeting them where they are is so critical, and that's one of the reasons why Alexandra, you asked earlier about the ways that we can change this is having an integrated funding model like Ann is talking about, right? So at PMV, we have grants, low interest loans, and venture, and it's all about meeting those founders where they are. And again, and as much as Diane and I hate this, because we heard this a lot yesterday at one of our investor meetings, not romanticizing venture capital for lack of a better term, because most women, and specifically women of color, are really in business to live and to survive. They are not in business to move to an exit and become a unicorn. To Ann said, to just create a cash cow and be successful in that. And that's so important.
I do have one more question because I know we want to have a little bit of time for audience Q&A. And this is a question that really could go to anyone. Given my background, more focused on public policy, I am curious if any of you all see a role for government, for public policy, to create like this enabling environment for women founders, for a variety of the different topics that we've touched on today. Is there a particular policy that you'd like?
I got one.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to say this once. We need to get the ERA into the Constitution. That will change everything. That I just got to say that. You know, we're so close. Take it away. Yeah, I couldn't resist. Sorry to get political, but you did say government.
In addition to that, that would be great. That would absolutely be great. But there are some models or some states, you know, nationally, is going to be some work to Ann's point. Nationally, I mean, statewide, there have been some things that have been done around the SSBCI money, and there's been some things relative to the ARP money that some states that have, for lack of a better word, people with sense running these programs have been able to do. Baltimore Maryland comes to mind. Specifically, they have a fund just for women that helps them with everything from the capital to paying for an employee for a year to ensure to help them to move towards sustainability. So there are certain, but it's going to take legislation to mandate that some of these funds are put in place in proper places and used from a proper perspective. So yeah, that part.
Vivian, did you have something to add?
Nothing to add on my end. Thank you.
So we do have, it looks like I have one question from the audience in the Q&A chat box so far. And this is, you know, anyone who has a response can jump in here. Are there any research studies or statistics that demonstrate a correlation between increased female representation in the C-suite and a corresponding increase in the number of senior women leaders in other areas of the company? So that's one part. The other part of the question is, have any studies shown a connection between higher female representation at the executive level and improved benefits, including maternity leave, parental care, et cetera?
I'm going to leave that to Viv. That sounds like her territory.
I think, yeah, we, you know, BNY Mellon came out with this paper called, you know, Pathway to Investing, right? To inclusive investing. And in that paper, there are a number of studies that we conducted, just, you know, showing correlation to, you know, when you have women in leadership roles, what that does is actually, you know, it filters down, right? Because there, with women in leadership roles, there are better diversity policies and program in place to actually empower women to grow in their career. There's advancement opportunities for women to actually get into senior leadership roles. So yes, we do actually see that. We see that where there is women on boards and in the C-suite, you know, you have women who are actually have programs in place to advance women into senior leadership roles. Yes, so we do, there are studies out there showing that. So we do see that.
Yeah, I would add to that a much more a cultural thing, because I have to say, in gosh, nearly a half a century of a career, I've worked for somebody else fewer than 5 years because I never was a great employee. I was too bossy. But anyway, what I would like to say is that as there are more women in positions of leadership or on boards, that shows other women that this is possible. You know, and when in the early days when I started out, I was frequently the only woman in the room, and that was just my my state of being, and I got used to it, and I got
Alexandra
comfortable.
First Capital Partners recognizes the need for affordable.
And so I think that seeing more women in those roles naturally brings up more women to be in those roles. And I would also like to say there's an old trope, again, let's put it back in the last century, that women in the leadership positions who'd made it to the top were not helpful. Well, if you consider what they had to do to get there, to carve out a space, and usually there wasn't a seat at the table, they had to make it. So, or pull up a folding chair, as Shirley Chisholm said. But what happens now is, we all know, we've all heard about lean in, but now it's hand up. If you have women in your organization, make sure that the women that you think should be advanced are in the right meetings, they have the right mentorship, they have the right sponsorship to get where they want to go, and let's lift everybody up together as we go.
That's the perfect place to pause for a moment, because I think as we reach near the end of the webinar, I do want to leave folks with some suggestions for what they can do, right? Like, there are things that we all can do who are on this webinar right now to help support an equitable system for women. And so for each of you, I want to ask the question of, what can folks do? What action steps can they take today that's going to lead to that equitable business ecosystem for all women?
I'll go. Well, for one thing, support female and local entrepreneurship. It's really, really important. It's funny, I was talking to a colleague yesterday, she made such a great point. She said she went to a meeting and it was about local entrepreneurship. She said, yeah, she walked into the meeting and the food was from this chain, the drinks were from that chain. it's you know, like, what are we doing at the end of the day? And so start by, you know, really spending your dollars locally and supporting women-owned businesses. That is the first thing. And then lobby and talking. As I said this earlier, maybe some of you in the panel may not have heard, I was quoted in the Daily News yesterday, and that is because we don't just do this work from one aspect, we do it also by advocating. And it's so important to make sure that your voice is heard around issues that impact women in particular.
Yeah, if I can just add to what Tanya said, you know, I think one key aspect is really around engaging, right? Engaging with business owners, engaging with individuals on what we can do to promote equity in the workplace. If your company employs best practices as it pertains to DEI, sharing that with others in your network, I think it's very helpful. And I have friends, you know, friends and family who, you know, it's probably not shocking to you all, but the majority of individuals that do actually take charge of household finances are men. Women are, you know, women take the backseat when it comes to, you know, the investing and the financial responsibilities for the home. And I think, you know, there is lack of education, and we need to do more around providing education around you know, what happens when women invest, right? When women take charge and take control, taking control of their finances. I mean, you know, the more wealth creation women get, you know, the more wealth that is created for women, you actually see that the more likely they are to actually champion causes that do benefit their families, but also the society and planet. Women are more likely to invest for social and climate impact. So the more we can do around educating women around investing and engaging with them on best practices, I think the better for the society and communities at large.
And what I'd like to add, because I agree 100% with everything that has been said about this. Mine is more cultural. What do women do? We form community. Be in community. Don't try and go through this alone. We don't have to be alone. Jillian and I have built up a community now of close to 200 or 300 other women fund managers like us. Because when we launched this, we did what women do. We went to the well to find out who's talking. And we've been doing that for 5 years now. And it is astonishing, the people that we meet, and from the US and also from Latin America and Africa and Europe. It's been wonderful. The second part of that, which leads into what I just said, is I think it's part of the reason that we stay separated is somebody mentioned making judgments before. I think it might have been in Kelly's remarks. I find it much better to put judgment aside and go in with curiosity. What get in this person's head? What are they thinking? I mean, I'm obviously who I am, a cis white woman. I want to know everybody else and what's happening in their minds because I'm curious. And out of that curious comes a better understanding and a stronger community. So find the people who are doing what you are doing, no matter whether they're exactly like you or not, and go out, and because also in the strength, in the numbers comes strength and power.
This has been fantastic. Diane, if you're, before you hop on, we did have one more question from the audience. I think we have like a minute or two for that. For anyone who has a response, do we see a growing asset class of products promoting racial and gender equity?
I can take that. I think right now there are very few products out there in the industry that do promote racial equity. We see most of the products that we see from a DI lens is really around it's gender, it's around gender, women, strategies that do have a gender focused lens, right? Where they're looking at women on boards and women in C-suite. But we need to see more products around racial equity. And I think that is coming. The more we talk about this topic, and also from a research standpoint, because we are engaging with every investment manager, regardless of whether they have DEI strategies or not, and the demand that's coming from clients for these types of products, managers are starting to pick up on that. And we expect that, we'll start to see more and more solutions out there in the marketplace that are focused, that do have a racial equity lens, and more of the gender focused strategies as well, because we see today that, a lot of times now clients actually want to see diverse businesses, and if a business is not diverse, you're actually leaving money on the table and they'll move on to the next person. So we're seeing it's very few right now, but, we'll likely start to see that tick up as demand grows.
Thank you, Vivian. I found all of you to be a fascinating, really energizing conversation. It's been great to be with this brilliant panel of women. And with that, Diane, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, oh my gosh, just thank you, Tanya and Vivian, Alexandra. What a powerful, insightful, informative discussion. And I want to close with a couple things. Anne said it very well. When you invest in women, when women are in financial decision-making roles, when they're in leadership roles, it's not just the right thing to do, it's good business. We always say when you invest in women, it's smart economics for all the reasons you have all said. So this is a call to action. And part of what we do, the purpose is to educate people. And I'm talking to you, women. If you're thinking about investing, invest through women. If you're an employer, hire more women, mentor more women, promote more women, design for women, vote for more women, and listen, as Anne said, to women. These are concrete things you can do. And we're asking you to join us and build a larger community, which Anne said. We don't have to do this alone. There are many women out there who are really committed to this work, who are making changes. You just listened to 3 of them right here. And Alexandra at JPMorgan is doing a lot of this work as well. So reach out to the folks. We will send a recording of this. We're going to send you a bunch of resources that if you want to learn more about this topic or opportunities, please do. You can also reach us. We're also going to send you a survey, so please take your time. We want your feedback. And I hope you are been inspired to take action. You know, as Anne said, we won't rest until we achieve equity. And Women's Way is not going to rest. We've been doing this for 45 years and we're not going to stop. So again, thank you all. You are all fabulous. Have a great night and have a wonderful summer. Bye-bye.